And now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's program over to Sherry Mangum. Sherry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Sherry Mangum, and I'm the Director of Marketing for FreeBorders, and I would like to add my welcome to today's webinar on remote infrastructure management. We're pleased to have two distinguished industry experts with us today to share their thoughts about how companies are leveraging remote infrastructure management to drive their business goals. First, let me introduce our host for today's session, Ed Nair. Ed has spent more than 20 years in technology research and journalism, specifically tracking the global outsourcing industry since the early 90s. He is currently the editor of Global Services, managing the publication's editorial team, both in India and the U.S. In prior roles, he was the editor for enterprise computing at DataQuest and won the Polestar Award for Best IT Journalist in India in 1998. Global Services has just released their 2010 Global Services 100 study, and Ed will bring up some of the findings from this study during our session today as they specifically relate to the adoption of remote infrastructure management. Joining Ed today is Paul Liu. Paul Liu is FreeBorders Chief Information Officer and Head of Managed Services. He has overall responsibility for information technology, security, and quality. Additionally, he leads the FreeBorders Infrastructure Outsourcing Services practice. Paul has over 17 years of experience in information technology and has worked and lived in the U.S. and in Asia. He's been working on the ground in China for over 8 years, so he brings a significant understanding of the Chinese and Western cultures. Before we dive into today's topic, I just want to remind you that we have time reserved at the end of the webinar to take questions. So make a note of your question during the webinar, and please alert the operator when we open the floor for questions. And Ed, without further ado, I would just like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, for a great welcome. Welcome everyone on this webinar. This is Ed Nair from Global Services. We are just out of the Global Services 100 research, and the area of remote infrastructure management, has come out as a very, very hot topic. The global IT infrastructure market has been growing exponentially over the past few years, and one can see this growth, across, diverse industry verticals, which includes manufacturing, retail, high-tech, media, publishing, telecom, and financial services, of course. Most of the big deals that have happened since last year have come from these verticals. What one also saw was that the nature of the infrastructure management services market has also changed. The model has changed from a traditional large format infrastructure outsourcing to much more, offshore, remote managed services with a lot of sub-services under the overall ambit of infrastructure management. And FreeBorders is one such company that has got very high stakes in this market. And in today's conversation with Paul Liu, he is the CIO as well as the leader of for infrastructure management services at FreeBorders. And in my conversation with him, I would be briefly touching upon some of our research findings from Global Services 100, as well as we'll get to hear from Paul how this market is shaping and evolving. Okay, to start off, as I mentioned, 2009 was the year of infrastructure consolidation. And from our study, we saw that there has been fantastic demand. Despite the recessionary economy, there's been a fantastic demand for infrastructure management services. Paul, why do you think that companies are looking so closely at infrastructure management services, especially considering the fact that infrastructure management services has always been there? It is as an industry practice, it's more than 30, 40 years old. But then, what is the reason for this renewed interest in this area?
Thanks, Ed. I think firstly, I want to thank everyone for this opportunity to share some insights in the area of remote infrastructure management. Ed, back to your question, I'm seeing about 3 different, very distinct reasons for the high interest in remote infrastructure management, especially in the area of fast-growing and mid-market companies. Firstly, just from my experience in talking with a lot of fellow CIOs and customers as well, there are certain components of IT infrastructure that has definitely reached a maturity level that can be considered almost a commodity. And by that, I mean 5 nines uptime in terms of service level is easily achievable. So what that means is if most of the companies out there are able to achieve that level of uptime without significant investment, and this is actually attributed to the reliability of internet service providers, certainly vendor services and vendor equipment, such as Cisco, and on the system side, multiple layers of redundancy. And what that really means is it has truly become a commodity. And by definition, there is not a whole lot of competitive advantage to basically managing your own commodity in this particular case, certainly your own infrastructure. So that's one thing. Basically, the playing field has leveled for a lot of companies managing their own infrastructure. Secondly, infrastructure management continues to be an incredibly high-cost area. What we're seeing is a lot of IT organizations worldwide still devote up to about 75% of their budget and certainly 50% of the personnel to the maintenance of existing IT infrastructure. This impacts the bottom line directly, and it certainly significantly limits companies' ability to innovate and to stay competitive in a very fast-changing marketplace. And as we all know, for companies that have been involved in outsourcing, outsourcing infrastructure management not only reduces OpEx, but which is certainly in this economic climate, it also allows companies to focus their energies more on innovation, and in that case, which is very, very key to staying competitive in this marketplace.
Okay. Now, it has been a revelation of sorts that, though infrastructure management, as I mentioned now, is quite old a practice within overall outsourcing, the offshore potential of infrastructure management, was discovered just a few years back. And ever since that got discovered, one has seen a lot of market momentum, with vendors rushing in to provide infrastructure management services in the managed services model from offshore locations. And we noted during our study that most of the buyers also mentioned that remote infrastructure management has got great offshore potential, much more than ADM, the traditional application development and maintenance, as well as some of the BPO areas. So could you characterize the reason why one would say that remote infrastructure management has got great offshore potential?
Absolutely, Ed. While we still see heavy demand for applications development outsourcing, what we are seeing is remote infrastructure management really catching up and is the new frontier for offshoring. By definition, companies can outsource operationally oriented IT tasks, which actually, again, allows them to refocus some of their IT infrastructure and applications teams on key business priorities and high-value initiatives. And certainly leveraging offshore partners such as FreeBorders from a access to talent perspective. We have incredible access to the majority of new college grads, as well as the ability to build teams that work across multiple time zones for true follow-the-sun support. And specifically for FreeBorders, we've been operating in China for more than 11 years now, and with our process maturity and relationships within the Asia-Pacific region, as well as partnerships with key vendors, we're able to bring and leverage extensive experience, certainly delivering from China. And I think the whole concept of remote infrastructure management, which is very operationally oriented, lends it quite well to offshoring. Large companies have been taking advantage of BPO type of outsourcing, the BPO model for quite some time. And I tend to define remote infrastructure management as the perfect marriage of a BPO model coupled with technology. I think if you put those two characteristics together, you have a very compelling reason to leverage a remote infrastructure outsourcing.
Absolutely. In my previous conversations with FreeBorders executives, I gathered that FreeBorders had already been delivering a variety of infrastructure management services, from offshore locations. And this week, I happen to see that FreeBorders has announced a suite of remote infrastructure services. So, could you just detail out what does this suite of remote infrastructure services entail, and what benefits could customers specifically look forward to, and what is the whole philosophy behind packaging some of these services in the way that you chose to?
Certainly, and Ed, I'm glad you've been tracking a lot of our press releases, as you always do. So in terms of remote infrastructure outsourcing, FreeBorders partnering with key customers, we've been actually providing such services for 2+ years now. And over the past 12 months, what we've done is taking a very concerted effort to understand the market, talk to our customers, and package remote infrastructure management as a key service line, as a key business unit for us. And we continue to see an incredible amount of interest in this area. And talking to some customers, some new customers, they've actually this actually has garnered a lot of attention for them with regards to what we can bring to the table. So just to define a couple of areas and highlight, what was in the press release this week, I'd like to bring attention to just to 3 key areas. Firstly, in the network operations services area of the 3, this is really at the heart of the infrastructure for a lot of companies out there. As we all know, without network, a lot of applications, business processes would stop running. And some of the services that we provide in this area include network and security monitoring, device log reviews, which we all know in this day of Sarbanes-Oxley is key to security and certainly from a compliance perspective as well. Also, a lot of the daily operations associated with keeping a network running, such as patch management and update and access management, and also change control that often keeps a lot of onshore IT resources, up at night and also on the weekends. Some of the core areas that we focus on, especially from a vendor perspective, include Cisco platforms as well as Huawei 3Com switches. And from a talent perspective in the network area, we have a slew of well-certified Cisco engineers, and also in the area of security, very commonly what you'll find is a combination of CISSP, which is one of the higher-end security certifications, as well as the CISA, which equates to the Information Security Auditor certification. Mm-hmm. The second area I do want to highlight is within database operations. In this area, again, very common operational services such as performance and fault monitoring, log reviews, change control, and also cloning of databases is what we've seen across the board as very common operational-oriented type tasks across all of our customers. And in fact, a lot of these types of tasks are so incredibly mature, it's almost a runbook that needs to be executed by onshore resources. And what we found is the more mature the tasks are, not necessarily the easier, but they're actually more earlier candidates that can be offshore from a task perspective. From a technology perspective for database operations, we're looking at, again, very similar to Western companies. You're looking at Microsoft, SQL Server, Oracle databases, as well as your open source component, which is MySQL. And then the third area I do want to highlight is in the area of systems operations. And then this includes, from a platform perspective, your very common open source Linux and Unix variants, such as Red Hat. We're getting a lot of requests in the area of AS400 and AS400 operations. I think a lot of the verticals in the area of financial services as well as travel, there's still heavy dependence on AS400 systems. And what we find is, talking to a lot of customers, there is a huge need to build up resources around this area because the generation that grew up on AS400 has begun to retire. And then some of the newer technologies within the Windows Server area, such as Microsoft Exchange and SharePoint, in the IBM area, WebSphere, more open source in terms of JBoss and Apache continue to draw a lot of interest in terms of systems operations. And then from a data center operations perspective for systems operations, you're seeing very common operational tasks such as performance and fault monitoring, very similar to the other two, such as OS patches and updates and access management, and also change control. And what we've seen is an offer, as a part of the new offering, IT organizations do have the flexibility to either designate specific parts of their infrastructure, whether it's systems operations, database, or network areas, that can be outsourced to a complete end-to-end infrastructure managed coverage. And where we have flexibility to be able to create teams around each of these areas and scale it according to the needs of the individual client. The other offshoot of this, and what we found working with companies that have been in a very high growth mode, is that they really have not had an opportunity to focus internally on process. And what we do bring to the table as we look at remote infrastructure management services for these customers is that we actually bring a higher level of process maturity. A lot of our processes are focused around best practices in the ITIL maturity model. And this includes areas like the service desk, incident management, and certainly production change control. I hope that helps paint a clear picture of our offering, official offering this week, and what we have been executing for some of our clients over the past 2.5 to 3 years.
Sure. Now, out of all of these, 5 areas that you mentioned, which is the one that you see, the strongest demand from the market, and which are some of these areas that can, have the biggest business impact for companies? What do you see from the demand side?
From the demand side, there are 2 areas that come to mind. Certainly, and this actually matches quite well with the level of remote manageability and also maturity of the processes around these infrastructure areas. Specifically in the systems, these are in the systems and database management area. And recently, with the proliferation of things like virtualization of servers, and certainly the inherent what I would term touchless management of databases, these 2 areas have certainly matured faster, much faster than a networking and security area. And what we found is they're much more receptive for remote management. I think it's been a long time from personal experience that a DBA has had to really enter the data center to actually touch the box. So that inherently makes it quite well for remote management. And I think just from a toolset perspective, the proliferation of remote management tools for both systems and databases, especially by the vendors and third parties, they've actually enabled what's called the staff-less data center. And because of that, these 2 specific areas, database and systems, is the area that we actually recommend our clients to start with from a infrastructure component perspective for infrastructure outsourcing.
Right. When companies like FreeBorders come up with such suites of information, such suites of infrastructure services, it is also easier for companies to actually pick and choose the areas that they want, as you just mentioned. This is in keeping with the trend that we saw during the GS100 study that large companies have anyways been using a lot of managed infrastructure services for some time now. But one has also seen that there has been a big draw from mid-sized and smaller companies who are now able to choose remote infrastructure management services as they want from companies like you. Could you just tell me a bit more about the kind of companies that go in for such services?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely correct in that Fortune 500, even Fortune 2000 companies have been first to reap all the benefits of an outsourced delivery model. And what we've seen is, according to a recent Gartner report, in offshore services, certainly remote infrastructure management, have also become a very viable service delivery model for mid-market and fast-growing businesses. And with the same tangible savings and productivity enhancements that the larger companies have been able to attain. And what we found is, a lot of these companies that have talked to us in the mid-market section and some even early-stage startups, they're actually looking at remote infrastructure management as an area that they can certainly, not just from a cost savings perspective, but also access to a wide talent pool. Often in a lot of markets within the U.S., from an employment perspective, it's still difficult to, being a smaller company or a mid-market company, it's still difficult to attract the level of talent that's required to maintain their own environment. So what we've seen is, firstly from a cost management perspective, to be cost competitive, and certainly access to talent. We've seen a lot of companies talk to us to be their partner within the Asia-Pacific region to be able to address these two main areas. So I think in short, yes, for this particular area, now large companies in the past have been at the forefront of this outsourcing wave and move very heavily into remote infrastructure management. Mid-market and startup companies, fast-moving companies, are really able to leverage this recently in the last couple of years with the proliferation of remote managed services, from companies like FreeBorders, and to be able to actually catch up to a lot of the advantages of a fully managed services opportunity delivering from Asia.
True. Well, I think that very clearly explains the growth phenomenon that we see in this market. A combination of factors like one is improved offshore ability of infrastructure management services. The process-centric approach towards managing infrastructure, the breaking up of the overall infrastructure management services stack into discrete services, and vendors like FreeBorders, offering these services in a discrete manner. I think all of this put together, gives an explanation to the growth phenomenon that we have in this market. As to why is this market so explosive in terms of growth, with many smaller and mid-sized companies being able to have access to these kind of services from vendors like you. All of your explanations put these things pretty much perfectly in perspective. Now, what is when I would like to now move on to some of the vertical industries that you have been talking to. Looking at this market in terms of the verticals, which are those industries that you see more amenable to taking up remote infrastructure management services, and what is it about these industries that wants them to go the RIM route?
Very, very good question, Ed. I think by definition, a lot of the infrastructures of companies across just about every vertical you see is very common. I think unlike applications development, for example, where vertical knowledge, domain knowledge is key, or outsourcing, what we see is a lot of the networks, systems, and certainly database operations from a technology stack perspective as well as from an operational perspective, there are a lot of commonalities. But with that said, we do see a couple of key industries that are adopting RIM in a much more aggressive manner. I think certainly financial services, for example, early on they have been at the forefront of taking advantage of outsourcing, specifically in BPO, such as credit card processing. But we're also seeing a lot of adoption from high-tech or internet-based businesses. I think the nature of high-tech companies in general are much more open to leveraging offshore resources, only because, as I alluded to earlier, the access to the talent is critical for companies that are fast-moving in the mid-market and high-tech to be able to address some of those key talent needs. And again, what we see is, the uptake in high-tech internet-based businesses, incredible demand. I think certainly with what we're looking at now, the definition of infrastructure and being quite agnostic across multiple verticals helps us to be much more attractive and actually offers more opportunity across almost all verticals to take advantage of remote infrastructure outsourcing.
Right. We also see a lot of startup companies, especially in areas like Web 2.0. I mean, such companies have a heavy focus. I mean, a kind of a heavy requirement for infrastructure to be managed and maintained. Do you see a lot of these internet startups also coming your way?
Oh, absolutely. Having grown up myself in the Silicon Valley Bay area, one area that I am seeing quite a bit is during the .com era, a lot of startup companies tend to build their own infrastructure, incur huge capex. So what I'm seeing now in the last couple of years, as we talk to more and more startups in the high-tech area, they're looking at what's really core to them from a business perspective. And having the majority of their staff maintaining their own networks, data centers, systems is, they've come to the conclusion that is not core. So what we're seeing is a few startups, many startups in fact, coming to us and basically say, you know what, help me build a remote infrastructure team that you manage and help us manage the services of that. So that's been a huge eye-opener for me just in the last, having grown up in the .com generation as well and through the uptick of that. And then recently, talking to more and more startups taking this approach. So that's definitely been an incredible eye-opener just in the last 2 to 3 years in startup companies. Right.
Okay, now with, so many of these mid-sized and smaller companies, looking at, RIM as a service area that they can leverage on from a third-party company, you would see, a lot of companies, of various types, wanting to, have access to these services. But there is always this factor about, the organizational readiness to be able to take on and, go with the service. So what are some of the key steps that you would prescribe, that are essential for companies to be able to, adopt RIM?
I think, again, with, outsourcing in general has been around for about 20 plus years, certainly starting within the India region. And I think the vernacular of outsourcing has been almost common knowledge across the consumer and certainly across the corporation. But I think there are still 3 very key areas that what we've seen across the board as still very important in order to fully leverage outsourcing. Firstly, definitely organizationally. What we've seen is you need to ensure that your staff is educated on the idea of outsourcing, how it is strategic to the business, and most importantly, ensure a cultural fit. I think where most outsourcing in general fail is there's a lot of pushback from existing staff on this specific area. And I think definitely a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and then finding the right balance of communication and understanding across the board within the organization is going to be key.
Right.
Secondly, what we've seen is when it comes to outsourcing, it's very, very important to take a very strategic approach. One area that we do is when we work with our customers who are fairly new to outsourcing, we work with them very closely on ensuring readiness via Get Ready engagement. And then from a strategic perspective, we partner with them on planning and integrating the outsourcing or global remote team model as a key component of how they augment their staff and which area to offshore in a very strategic manner that is very well communicated and prepared. So that's absolutely key, taking that strategic approach. And thirdly is certainly process maturity. I think one of the big reasons why BPO type of business model lends itself quite well to outsourcing is that those business processes can be broken down into very discrete chunks. And what we've seen is, from a process maturity perspective, So smaller startups or mid-market, fast-growing companies may not have that level of maturity yet. And alluding to what I mentioned earlier, one of our key services that we work with our customers on is break down work chunks or business processes, IT operations business processes, into specific areas with a clear, finite definition of what that process is, and document it, knowledge transfer it, and then continue to test and improve on a continuing basis so that you do reap a lot of benefits of a more mature business process model when it comes to outsourcing. So that absolutely is key. The more you have your processes defined, well documented, and can be transferable to a remote location, the more benefits you would reap from that.
Right. Makes sense. Now, FreeBorders is planning to offer, much of these services from its offshore centers in China. Now, considering China, what do you have to say about, the availability of talent for, in the infrastructure area, in China? Is there enough talent? Is there enough diverse talent that you have for the kind of services that you plan to offer? Is it available in China?
Well, Ed, I think unsurprisingly, I definitely get this question quite a bit. I think, and I'll actually share some specific experience. I think 8 years ago when I took on a position back in China, I had the impression that the technology would be different, the vendors would be different, but very surprisingly, a lot of the infrastructures for the local domestic Chinese companies in the area of networking systems, databases, for example, are very common, almost exactly the same as what you find in the U.S. So what you see is a lot of the infrastructure that leverages, whether it's a Cisco as a vendor for network equipment or Microsoft for systems, and things like Juniper, EMC, Hitachi, Sun Microsystems. They're all very common across the board on a global basis when it comes to the company's infrastructure. So what does this mean? I've actually found it personally incredibly easy to find the same level of the resources with common talent, whether it's in the area of Cisco or Microsoft or across all the other technology stacks, to be very similar to what we're seeing in the U.S. And I think over the past 8 years, they've continued to expand that market from a talent perspective. And a lot of companies, and I'd like to highlight FreeBorders again, what we do is as a global outsourcing company, we develop training programs to be able to bring up computer science majors, engineering majors of students, and be able to customize some of those training programs specifically for our customers. So I think in short, much to my surprise, 8 years ago, managing infrastructure for Chinese companies and access to the talent to manage these infrastructures was very similar to my experience in the U.S. And that to me was, again, quite a little bit of an eye-opener with regards to access to that talent.
Right. Okay. From a client point of view, outsourcing itself, especially companies that are new to outsourcing, security has always been a major concern in any outsourcing engagement, and more so when you talk about outsourcing your infrastructure, especially with companies, these new kind of companies that hold a lot of customer information as part of their information infrastructure. What is FreeBorders' approach to security?
Okay, I think security is always a top thing. That is thing, but security is always a top concern for us as well as for all of our clients. Having to also be in charge of FreeBorders security for our own corporate enterprise as well as customers, and I can attest to the fact that when it comes to security, it is at the top of just about everything we do. Specifically, we do have a very comprehensive security framework at every layer of the technology stack. At the corporate layer, we have our own internal NDAs as well as customer NDAs, And I always want to point to the fact that FreeBorders is a U.S.-based company, and we are abide by all the laws associated with that. And okay. And certainly down when it comes to like physical access at the physical layer, all of our ingress and egress points have security guards and CCTV, and security badges are absolutely required for entry into our delivery centers. At the other layers, such as the network and systems layers, they have very industry standard best practices when it comes to managing networks. We isolate our networks between our customers, so there's absolutely no access between different networks. And at the systems layer, every customer has their dedicated security policy, and we actually work very closely with the security teams of our customers to ensure that we meet their security policies as well as our own internal corporate security policies. And then at the higher level within the applications layer, that also provides a different level of security when it comes to things like roles and responsibilities and access to sensitive data. And then on a regular basis, our information security framework, which we actually term hypervigilance, is regularly audited by a well-known independent third party. And also we not only welcome, but we try to insist as much as possible regular security audits by the teams of our own clients. And we ourselves have gone through, me personally and my team, have always been sitting in front of the auditors from our clients, and I would like to say that we're probably one of the few, a small handful of service providers delivering from China that has actually passed the stringent requirements of Fortune 5 companies and certainly major banks, which we have many customers in that vertical.
Okay. Okay. No discussion about infrastructure management would be complete without talking about the impact of the cloud computing models, not only from the hardware and data center point of view, but also from the software as a service point of view. The impact, these new models, the cloud-based models, has on infrastructure delivery. And what is your point of view on how cloud-based models are going to impact infrastructure management? What are some of the challenges for vendors like you to be able to manage, this, transition to a new architecture, computing architecture, if I may call that, because cloud is very clearly an architecture in itself, just like we had Unix and client server, and services-oriented architecture. And now I think cloud is, the next architecture looming large on the horizon, and it's very much validated by everybody. So what is your viewpoint on, how things are going to pan out in this area for you?
Certainly, Ed. I think cloud is here to stay, no doubt about it. I think, what you see is companies actually like FreeBorders, for example, within our own infrastructure. We leverage we take a very balanced approach to leveraging cloud services. One specific example is, we're an incredibly global company where resources is spread across the globe. And one of the big advantages of using cloud services, specifically in an area of cloud-based email, for example, is that it's available from any point within the internet in a very secure manner. So that to us is incredibly attractive. So we ourselves have moved that component of our infrastructure onto the cloud. With that said, I think it's incredibly important for companies to find the right balance. I think Fortune 2000 will probably be slower adopters of cloud-based type services, certainly services such as storage and email, only because over the past in their company's history, there's a lot of investment within their own infrastructure. So they actually own a lot of that asset, and certainly from a security perspective and service level perspective, I think for Fortune 2000 companies, they still have an advantage with having basically total control of that environment. you counter that on more mid-market, fast-growing type companies, I think, compared to the .com where investment from investors was quite high, I think some of the more smaller companies are incredibly much more savvy with regards to leveraging CapEx spend, for example, and leveraging cloud services or the SaaS model of things like Salesforce, cloud-based storage will be much more attractive to them. But I think also with that said, I think once the company reaches a certain inflection point in terms of leveraging cloud services, you still kind of reach back into a very traditional question of lease versus buy. When it comes to cloud and SaaS-type models, that's a lease model. And when it comes to, for example, when you reach 2,000 seats in a cloud-based model, that may be much more expensive than actually bringing that back in-house. So I think, again, it's for companies that are considering this equation, and it's going to be different for every company depending on which industry they're in. You have to consider security, you have to consider service levels, and then you have to consider how global your workforce is and how critically important it is to be able to access company critical information or services from the internet.
Right. Okay, that was a great discussion, Paul, and you summed it up, in terms of your answers very well. Some of the key trends that are happening out there in the market, and I'm sure that the services that you have outlined would enjoy a tremendous amount of growth, in terms of uptake from the customers that you're approaching. I guess that brings me to the end of my discussion with Paul, and I would now like to turn it over to Sherry. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you to both of you for your insights, and we will now open the floor for questions. So, operator, I will ask you to make it possible for them to ask questions.
If you'd like to ask a question over the phone, please cue our operator by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad.
I clearly heard today, guys, that the question is not if, but when to take the plunge for remote infrastructure management. Sounds like maybe perhaps companies should start by seeking some expert advice on planning for this transition, maybe help in selecting a provider and making sure that there's an effective governance process in place to ensure that they realize they're really getting the benefits that they're seeking. So I really appreciate your insights today.
So Paul, I just wanted to, I just had an add-on question. Now you mentioned that, as part of, the new services that you're offering, you mentioned about, how organizations can get ready to, take advantage of these services. Now, as part of offering these services, what help do you render to these companies to be able to, get to that level of readiness? Is that part of your offerings as well?
Absolutely.
Being able to set a proper governance model for them, assess where they are and where they need to go to and stuff like that.
Absolutely, Ed. I think one of the keys I want to highlight is in a lot of the engagement that we take on with our customers, especially customers that are new to outsourcing in general, not specifically RIM. We insist on a lot of education, and we have a very mature model around working with our customers and education of their staff, the level of communication that's necessary in order to ensure that organizationally they are ready. And we have, what's termed, get ready engagements. We actually use that term specifically to describe identifying, components of business processes that we think are perhaps low impact and less customer facing, but can serve as very good examples to help prove this model within a company's organization. And those couple of areas that I highlighted have been incredibly successful across the board, especially around the area of for companies that are new to outsourcing.
Okay.
Okay, thanks again to both of you. Operator, do we have any questions queued?
You have a question from the line of Alan Hong.
Yes, thank you for giving me the chance to ask a question. I know FreeBorders is an American-founded company and headquartered in the U.S. And my question is that because most of the engineers are still working from China, and how do you? So I'm interested to know your strategy of and your practices how to break the language barrier.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I can certainly answer that question. One of the models that we've used, and this is actually a model that we call Chindas, Alan, and which is a combination of Chinese talent coupled with 20 years of Indian outsourcing a maturity model and U.S. relationship management. And one of the keys within this model is to be able to create teams within China with key positions that are fully English fluent, both certainly from a written and reading perspective and from a conversational perspective. So those would typically be your team lead or senior architect level engineers, and those would be the key customer facing touch points. And then on the U.S. side, what we also have is an onshore engagement manager that interfaces on a regular basis with our client. I think with this model, what we've seen is it actually has alleviated a lot of the language challenges from using engineers in China. And I think certainly from just my experience over the last 8 years in China, 8 years ago, I definitely would say a lot of the new college grads that I interviewed had conversational English difficulties. But in the last 4 years, I think with the educational system, a heavy focus by government entities to encourage innovation and technology in the outsourcing industry, the level of English from college grads, for example, I would say is up to better and capable at this point to interface directly with U.S. customers.
Right. And just to add on to Paul, I think Alan, the area of infrastructure outsourcing. When I look at the various other segments in outsourcing, infrastructure outsourcing is much less dependent. I'm not saying that it is not dependent at all, but it is much less dependent on language capabilities. And that again makes it much more of an offshoreable item within the overall scheme of outsourcing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And may I ask a second question?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Okay. So I've been noticing that there has been a big salary increases right now happening in China, and that's part of the I think part of the economic transformation. So how big impact that will be in your business model?
Let me tackle that one, Addon, sir. I think
Okay.
I think it's certainly well documented across the board. I think specifically with the Foxconn salary increases, and there's no doubt about it that a lot of the large cities in China will continue to experience exponential growth and salary increase. What we've been able to do, at least for FreeBorders specifically, is we have an incredible training program that we bring on qualified engineers and custom tailored training for our customers. So what that means is we continue to do a very managed rotation of resources across our teams. And usually the time span for an individual that stays in a position and then gets promoted is from 18 to 24 months. So I think from that specifically has been, my model within the remote infrastructure area is that we work very closely with our resources to work on their career development plan so that they're not, jumping across the street, for example, for an 8% increase. But we actually work with them very closely from a career management perspective to ensure that it meets their needs as well as the needs of the corporation. And certainly, with regards to the rates that we charge to our clients, I think a lot of it is what we're able to do is do it in a very managed manner with this type of career management. And I think that's just one example of how we do it within FreeBorders as an organization.
Okay, thank you.
Great answer, Paul. I couldn't do any better.
Okay.
Are there any other questions that have been submitted, operator?
There are no audio questions at this time.
All right. Well, unfortunately, it looks like it's time to wrap up today's session. So I would like to add my thanks to our speakers, both Ed and Paul, for sharing